The note landed in my jacket pocket exactly 6 minutes before I had to stand up in front of 200 people and deliver a wedding speech I had painstakingly rewritten 9 separate times. It was folded into a tiny, tight triangle, the exact, intricate style we used to pass across the aisle in 7th grade history. Except this wasn't a relic from a 12-year-old. It was from Clare Bennett, my sister's maid of honor. She was a woman who had spent the entire ceremony staring at me from across the aisle, studying me as if I were a complex puzzle she had finally, decisively resolved to solve. By the time she tucked that little paper triangle firmly against my ribs, brushing past me to walk back to her seat without uttering a single word, I had a very strong, undeniable feeling that my whole night was about to fall apart in the best possible way. My name is Jake Whitfield. I was 30 years old, a landscape architect who spent the vast majority of his working life overthinking drainage angles, root systems, and the structural integrity of retaining walls. Up until that particular Saturday in September, I would have confidently told anyone who asked that my life was calm, predictable, and entirely under my control. I had a steady job and a steady apartment. I was the kind of practical man who showed up with a level and a tape measure to help a friend build a deck, never once thinking to apply that same meticulous precision to the landscape of his own personal life. Claire had been my sister Emily's best friend since the two of them were 9 years old and got sent to the principal's office together for organizing a highly passionate petition against mandatory kickball during recess. That made 21 years of shared history. 21 years of Claire showing up at every single birthday party, every Thanksgiving, and every family disaster where someone inevitably tried to deep fry a turkey and nearly set the kitchen on fire. 21 years of watching her grow from a gap-toothed kid who literally bit people when they annoyed her into a 29-year-old veterinarian who still, on occasion, looked like she wanted to bite people who annoyed her. Except now, she did it with significantly better posture and an actual medical license. She was Emily's maid of honor that day, and I was the best man. Our sister and her fiancé, Tom, had, with absolutely zero subtlety, seated the two of us directly next to each other at the head table. It felt less like thoughtful wedding planning and more like a controlled chemical experiment neither of us had actively agreed to join. For the majority of the ceremony, Claire behaved exactly the way you would expect a perfect maid of honor to behave. She fussed over Emily's train before the walk down the aisle. She handed tissues to sobbing aunts, and she quietly mouthed, "You've got this," to Tom when his voice cracked halfway through his vows. She was composed, steady, and completely herself. Then, somewhere between the salad course and the very first clink of a fork against a champagne glass, she started staring at me. It wasn't a casual glance, nor was it the occasional polite eye contact you offer someone you are forced to sit beside for 4 straight hours. These were long, uninterrupted stretches of staring, as if I were a difficult mathematical equation she had decided to work through in real time. The first time I caught her doing it, I raised an eyebrow. "Do I have something on my face?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "An expression that is not helpful," I noted. "I was not trying to be helpful," she replied smoothly. "I was trying to be accurate." I laughed it off because that had always been our comfortable dynamic. Claire threw sharp verbal jabs like she got paid by the word, and I had built up a very specific, highly durable tolerance to them over 2 decades of friendship. It was safe. It was familiar. It was the kind of effortless banter you could maintain with someone without any of it meaning a thing, just as long as you never allowed yourself to notice how desperately you looked forward to it. But I noticed anyway. I had noticed for a very long time. I just never dared to say it out loud because Claire existed in that particular, untouchable category reserved exclusively for your sister's best friend. She was somewhere between a family heirloom and a sacred object, something you were allowed to appreciate from a respectful distance, but never, under any circumstance, allowed to actively want. Except she kept staring, and somewhere around her 5th glass of champagne, during a sudden lull in the music. She leaned across the 18 inches of white tablecloth separating us and spoke in a voice quiet enough that only I could hear it. "I need to tell you something before the toasts start, and I need you to not make it weird." "That is an incredibly aggressive way to open a conversation," I said. "I am aware. You do know I am about to stand up in front of everyone your family has ever met and talk lovingly about my sister's childhood trauma? I do know that. So maybe whatever this is can wait." She looked at me then. Really looked. It was the kind of deep, searching gaze that made the noisy, chaotic reception fold in on itself until there was nothing left but her and me and a centerpiece of white roses neither of us cared about. "It cannot wait," she said, her voice dropping lower. "Because if I wait, I am going to lose my nerve. And I have already lost it 4 times this month. That should have been my first real warning sign. I didn't take it. I was far too busy trying to remember the opening lines of my 3rd paragraph. 4 times about what?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the small, beaded clutch resting against the back of her chair, pulled out a folded square of paper, leaned across the table, and tucked it into my jacket pocket with 2 fingers. She did it with a directness that left absolutely no room for me to argue. "Read it after your speech," she commanded. "Not before. I need you to get through it without your voice doing something embarrassing." "My voice does not do things." "Your voice absolutely does things, Jake. I have heard it do things." Right then, the DJ tapped the microphone. Someone's uncle announced it was time for the toasts, and Claire sat back, looking entirely too composed for a woman who had just slipped a secret, folded note into a man's pocket at a wedding reception. I stood up on legs that 90 seconds earlier had felt perfectly reliable. I barely remember the speech itself. I know I mentioned Emily at 7 years old announcing to the family that she planned to marry a dinosaur. I know I made a dry joke about Tom being the first boyfriend Emily ever had who could actually assemble furniture without threatening the instructions with legal action. I said something about how real love was never just fireworks, that it was choosing to show up for the boring Tuesdays. People laughed at the right moments, Emily cried, and Tom hugged me entirely too hard afterward. Yet, the entire time, I was acutely aware of that folded triangle of paper resting against my ribs. Felt like it had a pulse of its own. I sat back down to a round of applause that I barely registered. Claire clapped along with everyone else, but she wasn't looking at the happy couple or the towering cake being wheeled out on its little cart. She was looking straight at me, waiting, her jaw set in a way I had learned over the years meant she was bracing herself for an impact. "Okay," she said quietly. Once the room settled down and the DJ put on something slower. "Read it." My hands were not steady. I want that on the official record, because I am a man who has spent a decade installing complex irrigation systems and building retaining walls for high-end clients who paid extra for absolute precision. My hands had never once shaken over a piece of paper before that night. I unfolded it beneath the edge of the table. For words. Her handwriting was small and slanted, the exact same handwriting that used to scrawl "meet me at recess" on torn notebook paper when we were kids. Except this time it said something considerably more dangerous. I read it twice, then a 3rd time, just in case the champagne had started editing my vision. I looked up. Claire had gone completely still. It was the way people go still right before they either run away or get run over by the weight of their own honesty. "Explain," I said, because apparently that was the single most articulate sentence my brain had access to in that moment. "I was going to wait," she said, her words tumbling out. "I had this whole plan. I was going to give it a few weeks after the wedding, act completely normal, and then maybe bring it up casually over coffee. I'd mentioned that I might possibly have feelings that are not entirely appropriate for a woman who has known you since you had metal braces and thought putting hot sauce on everything made you interesting. I still think that makes me interesting." That is not the point, Jake. What is the point, Claire? She exhaled hard enough to move a stray strand of hair off her forehead. The point is, I watched you give that speech about your sister, about choosing to stay through the boring Tuesdays. And I sat there and thought, I have been in love with this idiot for at least 6 years, and I keep telling myself it is only because he is familiar. And it is not just because he is familiar. It has never been only because he is familiar. The reception kept moving in a blur around us. Somewhere behind me, Emily was dancing with Tom, laughing at something. Both of them lit gold under the warm string lights. Somewhere to my left, my mother was crying happy tears into a damp cocktail napkin. None of it registered. Only Claire's voice existed. 6 years, I repeated, the number echoing in my chest. Give or take, she said, looking down. I am not doing the math out loud. It is embarrassing enough already. I sat there holding that folded piece of paper as if it might catch fire. Something that had been locked away in a very deliberately reinforced, heavily guarded part of my chest for a very long time finally gave out. Claire, I said. You do not have to say anything, she interrupted quickly, her defenses going up. I mean, please say something, but you do not have to say the thing I am hoping for. I just needed this to exist outside my own head for once in my life. I have been in love with you since the winter you fixed my mother's fence. She blinked, her breath catching. What? 4 years ago, I said. Emily's back porch, the one that completely flooded after that massive storm. You came over straight from an emergency surgery on somebody's golden retriever, still wearing your blue scrubs. Instead of going home to sleep, you spent hours helping me haul soaked, heavy lumber in the freezing rain because you said, and I am quoting you directly, a fence does not fix itself and neither does your mother's blood pressure. I remember standing there in the cold, looking at you, and thinking that whoever ended up with this woman was going to be the luckiest person alive. And then I remember absolutely hating that thought, because it was not supposed to be me. Why was it not supposed to be you? Because you were Emily's, I said. Not property, I don't mean it like that. I mean you belonged to a whole other, protected part of my life that felt entirely off limits. Best friend territory. Untouchable. Claire's eyes went bright and glossy, the exact way Emily's had during her vows. That is the single most romantic and also the single most infuriating thing you have ever said to me, and both halves are entirely true. I laughed, and the sound came out much rougher than I intended. I have had a lot of practice not saying it clearly. She reached over and gently took the note back out of my hand, smoothing it flat against the white tablecloth, almost as if she needed to look at her own handwriting to fully believe she had actually done it. So, what now? I looked at her. I looked at the dusty rose dress Emily had handpicked because she claimed it made Claire's eyes look like rich whiskey in good light, which, for the record, my sister was entirely correct about. I looked at the tiny, faint scar just above her left eyebrow from a dog bite in vet school that she never liked talking about. I looked at the woman who had spent 21 years standing just close enough to my life that I never had to admit how badly I wanted her right in the very center of it. Now, I said, I ask if you will dance with me, and I try my absolute best not to step on your dress. And later, when this is finally over, I take you somewhere quiet and tell you everything I should have told you 4 years ago in the rain. Claire's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile and not quite tears. That is a lot of promises for a man who just tripped over his own metaphor. I contain multitudes. You contain a landscaping business and an incredibly unhealthy relationship with mulch. Both true, I admitted. She stood up, smoothed down the skirt of her dress, and held out her hand. I took it, and the exact moment our palms met, something settled deep in my chest that had been violently unsettled for 6 years without my permission. We danced badly. Claire stepped on my foot twice and immediately blamed her heels. I spun her in the completely wrong direction and blamed the champagne. Somewhere in the middle of the song, Emily caught sight of us over Tom's shoulder. She went completely still, her jaw dropping, and mouthed something I couldn't fully make out, but absolutely understood the shape of. "Your sister just saw us," Claire whispered against my shoulder. "I am aware. She is going to lose her mind. She is getting married tonight. Let her have one more thing to cry about." Claire laughed, a low, warm sound right into the fabric of my jacket, and I felt the vibration of it everywhere. We didn't get a chance to talk properly again until nearly 11 o'clock. By then, the cake had been cut. Half the guests had migrated to the hotel bar, and Emily had predictably cornered Claire near the coat check, demanding a full, immediate, and highly detailed explanation. "You have been in love with my brother for how long?" Emily's voice was pitched somewhere between pure delight and dramatic betrayal. "Keep your voice down," Claire hissed. "This is your wedding. I do not care. This might be the best thing that has happened at my own wedding besides the wedding itself." I found them just like that. Emily gripping both of Claire's hands, her veil slightly crooked, looking as if she had just been handed a very specific personal lottery win. Claire caught my eye over Emily's shoulder and gave me a look that pleaded, "Rescue me," but also somehow, "Do not actually rescue me. I am thoroughly enjoying this." "Should I be worried you two are conspiring?" I asked, stepping up. Emily rounded on me instantly. "Jacob Andrew Whitfield, you have been sitting on feelings for my best friend for years, and you did not think to tell me." "I did not tell anyone. That was the entire point of the exercise." "That is insane. Do you know how many times I tried to set the two of you up, and you both acted like I had suggested something highly illegal?" Claire made a small, wounded sound. "You tried to set us up 14 separate times, Em. At some point, self-preservation kicks in. You could have just admitted it. You were about to marry your best friend since the 3rd grade." I said. "Forgive me for not wanting to make your entire engagement dinner about my repressed feelings for your brother." Emily threw her hands up, her veil bobbing wildly, and pulled Claire into a hug so fierce it nearly knocked them both backward into the coat rack. "I have been waiting for this since we were 14, she said, her voice muffled into Claire's shoulder. 14. Claire, I know you cried at my engagement party and told me it was because you were just so happy for me. I think now you were also having a full-blown emotional crisis about my brother." "That is not entirely inaccurate," Claire admitted, her cheeks flushing a deep pink. I stood there absorbing this new information like a man handed unexpected evidence at his own trial. "You cried at the engagement party because of me?" "I cried at the engagement party because you gave a toast about how Emily deserved someone who chose her every single day," Claire said, looking directly at me. And I looked around the room and thought, nobody has ever looked at me the way he was looking at his sister when he said that. And I desperately wanted somebody to. The background noise of the bar, the thumping bass of the DJ, my mother somewhere loudly explaining the seating chart to a highly confused uncle. All of it fell away again, just as it had at the head table. "I would look at you like that," I said softly. "I think I already have. I just made sure nobody was paying attention when I did it." Emily made a strangled, emotional sound and pressed both hands to her mouth. "I need to go find Tom. I need to tell someone this is actually happening. Do not either of you move." She vanished in a dramatic rustle of white tulle. And then it was just me and Claire, standing near the coat check with 100 heavy jackets hanging between us and absolutely nothing else in our way. "Your sister is going to make this her entire personality for the next 6 months, Claire said. "At minimum," I agreed. "I do not regret the note. I would hope not. It is currently the best piece of paper I own." Claire laughed, and some of the lingering tension finally eased out of her shoulders. I almost didn't do it. I stood at the head table through the whole ceremony, rehearsing this incredibly calm, mature conversation I was planning to have with you weeks from now. And then you started talking about boring Tuesdays, and I thought, if I do not do this right now, I am going to spend the rest of my life watching you fall for someone else and telling myself I was fine with it. You would not have been fine with it. No, she admitted softly. I would have been catastrophically not fine with it. I would have shown up to your wedding someday, smiled bravely through the whole thing, and then sobbed in my car in the parking lot like a woman in a movie nobody wants to make. I reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair back from her face. It was the exact motion I had wanted to make 100 times over the years, and had always talked myself out of. You are never going to have to find out. I am not marrying anyone who is not standing in this hallway right now. Claire's breath caught, a quiet but unmistakable sound. That is an incredibly aggressive statement for someone who has not even taken me on a real date yet. I am compensating for 6 years of cowardice. Give me some room. Fine, she said, a spark of her usual fire returning to her eyes. But you should know I have very specific date standards. I have watched you order at restaurants for 2 decades. I am well aware. No onions on anything you are going to be kissing near. I raised an eyebrow. You are already planning the kissing portion of the evening? I plan everything, Jake. I am a professional. You are a veterinarian. Professionals plan. That is the entire definition of the word. I laughed, and something in me that had been braced and careful for years finally, fully let go. I stepped closer, close enough that the noise of the reception blurred into distant static. Close enough to see the small fleck of gold near the center of her left eye that I had noticed exactly once before, for years earlier in the pouring rain, and had spent every day since trying desperately not to think about. Can I kiss you? I asked. Or is that also against professional standards? It is extremely against professional standards, she whispered, her hands sliding up to rest against my chest, right over the pocket where her notes still resided. Do it anyway. So I did. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic moment. There was no swelling orchestral music, no sudden wind machine, no crowd bursting into spontaneous applause, though, to be fair, that was probably only a matter of time given my sister's current emotional state. It was just Claire's mouth, soft and certain under mine. It was her fingers curling tightly into the lapel of my jacket. It was 6 years of careful, agonizing distance collapsing into something that felt less like falling and more like finally landing somewhere I had meant to land the entire time. When we broke apart, her forehead rested against my jaw, and I felt her let out an exhale like she had been holding her breath since roughly the 3rd grade. Well, she said, her voice slightly breathless, that solves the professional standards issue permanently. Glad I could help. Do not get smug, Whitfield. You still have to survive dinner with my parents. Your parents love me. My parents do not know yet that I have been in love with you since before I had a driver's license. This changes the entire tone of every future Thanksgiving. I grinned. Worth it. You say that now. Emily reappeared at that exact second, dragging a bewildered Tom by the hand, both of them wearing expressions of barely contained, manic delight. Are you two officially together? She demanded. I need this confirmed for planning purposes. What planning purposes? Claire asked, immediately suspicious. I already texted our mothers. Emily, you got married tonight. This is the one night I am allowed unlimited chaos. Tom wisely said absolutely nothing. He simply squeezed Emily's hand like a man who had already learned, in the very short time since becoming her husband, exactly when to stay quiet. Claire looked at me, exasperated and glowing in equal measure. This is entirely your fault. How is this my fault? You picked tonight to finally have feelings. You picked tonight to hand me a note. Fair, she conceded, a soft smile breaking through. Fair point. We didn't leave the venue until nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, long after most of the guests had gone home, long after the DJ had packed up his lights, and long after Emily and Tom had disappeared to share a second dance as husband and wife, slower and quieter just for themselves. Claire and I sat at an abandoned table littered with half-empty champagne flutes and scattered cake crumbs. Her shoes were off, her feet tucked beneath her on the chair, and my suit jacket was draped around her shoulders because the venue had gotten chilly and she refused, on principle, to admit it. So, she said, looking at me, tomorrow. You said something about telling me everything you should have told me 4 years ago in the rain with the fence. I leaned back in my chair, looking at her. Really looking, the way I had allowed myself to do maybe 3 times in 6 years and had always immediately punished myself for afterward. That is going to take significantly longer than one night. I have time, she said. You said you plan everything. You sure you want to leave this so open-ended? Claire reached over and laced her fingers through mine on the table, slow and deliberate. It was the same way she had handed me the note hours earlier, except this time there was nothing folded, nothing hidden, and nothing left for later. For you, she said, I will make an exception. The next morning, I woke up on my sister's guest room couch with a headache that had absolutely nothing to do with champagne, and everything to do with the fact that I had spent most of the night lying awake. I had replayed the sound of Claire's voice saying, I have always chosen you, until it stopped feeling like a sentence and started feeling like a fundamental fact of the universe. I had simply been too slow to notice it. My phone buzzed at 8:14 a.m. Are you awake? Or are you having a dramatic emotional recovery period? Claire's text read. I typed back, both simultaneously. She replied instantly, I need you to come get me. My car is still at the venue, and Emily's parents are asking me pointed questions about my future that I am not prepared to answer before coffee. On my way, I sent back. I got there in 11 minutes. Claire was sitting on her parents' front porch steps, still wearing yesterday's dusty rose dress with an oversized cardigan thrown over it. Her hair was down. She wore no makeup, and she looked somehow more devastatingly beautiful than she had in her full Maid of Honor ensemble the night before. You look terrible, she said affectionately as I climbed out of the truck. Thank you. You look like you slept 4 hours in a wedding dress on your parents' couch. I did exactly that. It is working for you. She rolled her eyes, but the twitching corner of her mouth gave her away. Get in the truck before my mother comes out here with a giant tray of muffins and a list of potential grandchildren names. She is not actually doing that. She has a Pinterest board, Jake. I have seen it. It predates last night by at least 2 years. I laughed, and the sound felt easier than it had in years. Lighter. It was as if something in my chest had finally stopped bracing for the other shoe to drop. We drove to the small diner near her veterinary clinic, the one with the notoriously terrible coffee and the undeniably excellent pancakes, and slid into a booth by the window like 2 people who had done this 1,000 times before. Because, in a way, we had. Just never with the specific, magnetic charge that now sat between us, warm and undeniable. Okay, Claire said once the steaming mugs of coffee arrived. Tell me the thing. The fence thing. So I told her. I told her about the winter 4 years earlier, the flooded backyard, and the lumber soaked through with rain. I told her about her showing up in her scrubs, smelling faintly of clinical antiseptic because she had come straight from an emergency canine surgery instead of going home to rest. I told her about the way she had laughed at some incredibly stupid joke I made while we hammered the freezing boards into place, and how that laugh had lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest and simply refused to leave. I went home that night, I said, and sat in my own driveway for 20 minutes because I could not figure out how to process what I was feeling about my sister's best friend. It felt like breaking into a part of a house I was absolutely not supposed to enter. Claire's eyes had gone soft and glassy as she listened. I went home that night and told myself I imagined the whole thing, that you were just being polite, and that it didn't mean anything that you kept finding excuses to hand me tools, even though I obviously already knew how to use them. I absolutely did that on purpose. I know that now, Jake. I wanted an excuse to be near you, I admitted. I just didn't have a better plan than power tools. She laughed, a bright, startled sound, and reached across the table to steal a piece of my pancake without asking. It felt somehow even more intimate than our kiss the night before, because it was so entirely, unguardedly us. "So what changed?" she asked, her tone softening. "Between the fence and last night. 6 years is a very long time to sit on a secret." I turned my coffee cup slowly in my hands, watching the dark liquid swirl. I kept telling myself I was protecting something. Your friendship with Emily, my relationship with my entire family. The fact that if things went wrong, I wouldn't just lose you. I would lose the version of every holiday where you are at the table laughing at my mother's stories, or arguing with me about whether a fence needs to be perfectly level or just look level. I did not trust myself not to ruin all of it. And last night, you handed me a note that made all of those worries sound like an excuse instead of a reason. Claire studied me for a long, quiet moment, her thumb moving idly along the ceramic rim of her mug. "For the record," she said softly, "I was scared of the exact same thing. I used to leave family dinners early sometimes because watching you be so normal, steady, and completely oblivious felt so much worse than just not being there at all." "I was not oblivious," I corrected gently. "I was heavily, tragically self-controlled. Same effect from where I was sitting." We sat there for a long time after the pancakes were gone and the coffee had gone cold. The diner slowly filled up around us with the ordinary, comforting noise of a Sunday morning. Young families, hungover college kids, and an elderly couple gently bickering over crossword clues. It didn't feel like the beginning of something fragile. It felt like something solid that had already been built, brick by brick, over 6 long years, simply waiting for both of us to stop pretending the foundation wasn't already there. "So," Claire said eventually, breaking the quiet, "what now?" Practically speaking, I take you on an actual date. Somewhere that is not a chaotic wedding reception or a sticky diner booth the morning after. I have standards, remember? No onions near the kissing zone. Noted. I'll edit the menu. Also, she added, I want you to meet my parents as this, not as Emily's brother, as the man I very obviously have feelings for. I have met your parents 40 times, Claire. Not like this. She had a point. There was a massive difference between being a familiar fixture at the edge of a family's gatherings and being the man who had just kissed their daughter at a wedding after 6 years of pretending not to want to. I understood that distinction now in a way I hadn't fully appreciated the night before. Dinner, I said. Friday night. I cook. Claire raised an eyebrow, a skeptical smile playing on her lips. You cook occasionally and with mixed success. That is not entirely reassuring. I make an excellent chili. Ask anyone. I will be the judge of that. You are always the judge. It is your whole personality. She kicked my shin lightly under the table, grinning, and something in me settled even further. The very last remnants of 6 years of careful, protective distance finally, fully dissolved. Friday arrived slower than I wanted and faster than I felt ready for. I changed my shirt twice, which felt deeply embarrassing for a 30-year-old man who had, until very recently, considered himself entirely unbothered by matters of personal appearance. I made a pot of chili that turned out significantly better than expected, mostly due to sheer terror-fueled focus. Claire showed up wearing jeans and a soft, forest green sweater. Her hair was down, she was holding a bottle of red wine, and she wore an expression that suggested she, too, had changed her outfit at least twice before leaving her apartment. "This is weird," she said, stepping inside and looking around. "I have been in your apartment 100 times, but it feels completely different now." "Different how?" "It feels like I am seeing it for the first time, which is objectively ridiculous, since I literally helped you pick out that couch 3 years ago." "You did pick out that couch. I still think about that argument sometimes. You wanted beige, Jake. Beige is an absolute crime against furniture. It is neutral. It is practical. It is cowardly." She dropped onto the couch, tucking her feet beneath her, entirely at home in a space she had occupied 100 times before. Except this time, when she looked up at me, there was absolutely nothing careful or guarded left in her eyes. The rest of the evening went the way dinners between two people who already know each other's rhythms tend to go. Easy, full of laughter, and punctuated by the kind of sharp banter that had defined our entire relationship. Except now, every single glance carried a weight it never had before. Every accidental brush of our hands over the salt shaker lingered a half-second longer than necessary. "You are staring again," I noted halfway through the meal. "I am allowed now," she said simply. "That was the whole point of writing the note." "Fair. Also, your chili is genuinely good. I am actually annoyed about it." "Why annoyed?" "Because now I cannot use terrible cook as an excuse to keep dating you at arm's length." "You were not going to do that anyway." "No," she admitted, her eyes softening. "But it would have been a very convenient excuse if I had needed one." After dinner, we ended up back on the couch. Her feet were draped comfortably in my lap, and a movie neither of us was actually paying attention to played quietly in the background. Her phone buzzed once, then twice on the wooden coffee table. She glanced at the screen, made a small, displeased face, and flipped it face down. "Everything okay?" I asked. "My ex," she said. "Marcus. We dated for about a year, ended things maybe 18 months ago. He resurfaces occasionally, usually when he is bored, lonely, or some combination of both." I kept my voice carefully even, though something protective flared quiet and immediate in my chest. "Do you want to answer it?" "No," she said. She said it simply, without a shred of hesitation. The exact same directness she had used to tuck that note into my pocket. "He wasn't cruel exactly. He just made me feel like wanting things. A real conversation, actual effort. Someone who bothered to remember my chaotic schedule at the clinic was somehow being high maintenance. I spent a year trying to make myself smaller so he wouldn't call me difficult." "You are the least difficult person I know," I said honestly. "And I say that as someone who has argued with you about furniture colors." That got a small, genuine laugh out of her. "I mean it, though," I continued, looking down at her. "I got very good at pretending I didn't need things. And then I watched you hand me tools in the pouring rain just because you wanted an excuse to stand near me. It completely wrecked something in me, because I realized I had forgotten what it actually felt like to be with someone who tried.